Boss fight is one of the elements that are present in many video games. Although not all games have varied boss fights, in the vast majority of these titles, an enemy with more power than others appears in front of the players. Now, the question is, which game was first introduced the boss fights to the world of video games? If you look at your own experience of games, the first boss fight that comes to mind is the Bowser of Super Mario, a memorable boss fight that many titles have been using in the years to come. Defeating Bowser required proper timing and tactics, which is a tough obstacle compared to other enemies you'll encounter in Super Mario. However, Bowser is not the first boss fight in the gaming world, and this element was used in games long before the release of Super Mario. Dungeons & Dragons is probably one of the most important games in history. Many of the great RPG-style titles probably wouldn't have been made if Dungeons & Dragons didn't exist. On the other hand, many other titles that use role-playing elements are indebted to this game. One of the important elements introduced to the gaming world by this game was the concept of boss fight. In 1974, Gary Whisenhunt and Ray Wood published a digital work called Game of Dungeons, commonly known as D&D. The game was first released on the Play-Doh platform. Play-Doh, in fact, was a set of connected computers that shared a shared server and was used at the University of Illinois, using this system for teaching assistants. However, the administrators of this system were not happy to use it for a video game. Game of Dungeons was rebuilt for the 8th time after being removed from the Play-Doh, and this version of the game is thankfully still being experienced by various emulators. Thanks to these emulators, we all know today that Game of Dungeons is the first game to use the boss fight. D&D had a simple gameplay and followed the basic rules of the original Dungeons & Dragons. Players searched for ancient objects called orb. It didn't matter what purpose these orbs were used for, the important thing was to achieve them after fighting the wizard and the other enemies. One of the creatures you encountered in the game was the Golden Dragon, which was tasked with protecting orb. To get the orb, you have to eliminate the Golden Dragon. Although fighting this dragon didn't contain any epic moments like modern video games, this big, powerful dragon is the first boss fight in the history of the gaming industry. It should be noted that without defeating this creature, you would not have been able to finish the D&D game. While the Golden Dragon of D&D is the world's first boss fight game, the confrontation with this creature is simple and banal compared to today's standards. In fact, the Golden Dragon was like a common enemy using a dope drink. However, the widespread use of boss fight in video games occurred with the release of arcade titles in the 1980s. Since there was no single definition of these final battles at this time, different developers disagreed on the basics of boss design. In the Destroyer arcade and shooter game released in the 80s, players faced with a huge suspended head after facing different enemies, which they had to shoot multiple times to destroy it. On the other hand, in Phoenix Arcade, the boss fight you eventually encounter is a spaceship protected by various shields. Once you have made a breach in its defense, you can destroy it after shooting at the center point of the ship. Despite minor differences between Phoenix and Destroyer, the two games share a fundamental similarity: boss never changed their tactics to deal with the player. While gamers might have encountered these bosses multiple times, they were able to eliminate them each time by adopting a repetitive tactic. In the 1980s, a developer called SNK released a ninja-based game called Sasuke vs. Commander, in which the bosses faced players in special stages. Unlike previous titles, these bosses did not follow a consistent tactic during combat and created more challenges for players through rotational movements and shooting at them. On the other hand, because of the diversity of these bosses, gamers never knew which one they were going to face. Although most of these bosses were destroyed by a single stroke, the tactic of fighting each of them differed considerably. Sasuke vs. Commander is probably the first game to use dynamic boss fights. But what was the first boss fight that had different stages? Black Hole, developed by Tokyo developer Densher Sekai, used boss that changed tactics several times during combat. Black Hole was a space shooter in which players battled the boss in two different phases. In its first phase, players had to shoot down a ship protected by a shield. In the next phase, the shields of the ship gained the ability to reflect bullets at the player, thereby attempting to destroy him. In this phase, players had to shoot at the ship only once, which was difficult to do. After defeating the ship, players could start the game from scratch and repeat the levels once more. Over time, the structure of the different stages of the game changed, and players encountered a separate boss at the end of each level. Kung Fu Master, released in 1984, is probably the first game to use a variety of boss in different stages. The boss of the game appeared at the end of each level, and to complete that level, players had to cross their barriers. The game's creator definitely modeled on other arcade titles and succeeded in creating bosses that had to be hit several times in the face to get behind them and eliminate them in this way. The game was later ported to consoles such as NES, and players could use the same tactic when fighting the boss. Soon, with the release of Super Mario Bros., boss fights, whose very basic principles are seen in modern games, were introduced to the world of video games. While the titles mentioned in the video are a small part of the gaming industry's boss fights, these games certainly used the boss as the ultimate challenge for the first time. In the absence of these titles, today we might have had to finish different games only by fighting small and ordinary enemies.